Hi everybody, it's Courtney and I'm back here with another video. Today I'm going to be using the Mother's Day stamp set as well as the spring stamp and die set and the double stitched oval dies, and I'm going to be using the largest die in the set, and we're going to be making an oval shaped card. So I'm going to take that largest oval shaped die and I'm going to die cut this 3 times, twice from heavyweight cardstock and one from Nina Solar weight 80-pound cardstock that I'll actually be doing my coloring on. So I'm going to take one of the heavyweight cardstock panels here and I'm bringing out my scoreboard. You can use your paper trimmer if you have that type that you can score with, and I'm just going to score maybe about not even a half an inch off to the one side. And this will be basically my score line so that my card can open and close. Going to go ahead and take that other panel there from that heavyweight, and that is going to go on top. So I'm going to go ahead and bend that one side down along that score line and add adhesive. Now I prefer to use liquid adhesive, especially being I'm trying to line up 2 ovals, but you can certainly use double-sided tape, whatever you prefer. Now I didn't give this enough time to really stick and it came right apart. So I did have to add a little bit more pressure and wait just a couple of minutes until that became permanent. So I'm going to go ahead and put that aside for later, and I'm going to bring out my panel of the Nina Solar weight 80-pound cardstock. Going to line this up in my MISTI here and make sure that this is down with a magnet, because if this shifts, I'll never know it. It doesn't obviously fit in the corner. I'm going to take that large floral stamp from the Mother's Day stamp set and line that up on the bottom or top, whatever it ends up being, onto my card panel. And I ended up stamping this twice with the Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink, so you can use any Copic Safe ink here. I did stamp this twice just because it is quite a large image and I wanted to make sure that I got a really good impression. Once I had that first stamped image down, I can go ahead and rotate my oval card panel and stamp it 2 more times on the other side. So I'm basically just creating a frame around this oval. And again, I did stamp this twice again, even though I did get a pretty good impression the first time. I wanted my images to be somewhat even. So I'm going to move on to the Copic coloring, and I didn't leave all of this in because I kept it pretty simple and it is just a little repetitive. So I'm going to start with this largest flower here in the center, and I'm going to be using my BG markers. I'm going to start with my lightest color to get the paper a little bit saturated, and this will make blending a little bit easier once the paper is just a bit saturated. And I also can map out those darkest areas so that if I make a mistake and put a shadow where I don't want it to be, I can easily cover up that lightest color. Next, I'm going to go in with the BG18, which is my darkest color, and I'm pretty much just going over those areas that I've already mapped out with the lightest color. I'm not adding shadows to every area that actually has a shadow, just because this color is pretty dark and some of these areas are super tiny. So I can always add shadows with my darkest midtone, which is the BG13. So not every dark area needs to be with the darkest color. But I'm pretty much just extending these areas out a little bit further. I'm extending those flick lines out for where the largest petals are, and then just creating a few more shadows for those petals that are behind. There's not a whole lot of room to work with those smaller petals, so I'm not too concerned with leaving too much of a highlight there. Next, moving on to the BG11, and again, just extending these areas out. And then I'll finish back off with that BG10 that we had started with to map out all those areas. Now, this is a kind of a difficult color combination. It blends beautifully, but I like to see a little bit more contrast. And sometimes you just don't get that with this BG combination. So what I ended up doing is I brought out 2 colored pencils, and I'm bringing out my Polychromos, and I'm just using 2 colors here that are just a little bit darker than the rest of the flower. And I'm just going to add these to the very darkest areas. So I'm starting with the darkest pencil, and I'm just going to extend those, or darken up, I should say, those shadow areas. So mainly in the center of the the flower where it's kind of dipped in a little bit, and also where one petal is lying behind another. I'm using a very, very light hand here. I'm barely pushing any pressure on the pencil to the paper at all. Once I have those deepest shadows down, I can bring out just slightly lighter. It's not super light. It's not going to blend in with those lightest Copic markers, but it's a little bit lighter than that darkest pencil. And I'm just going to extend those shadows out a little bit further. Now I'm even using a lighter hand here. You can see that I'm holding the pencil pretty far up. So that this way I can kind of control that amount of pressure that I'm adding. And you can also see that my pencil is kind of tipped to the side. And this will also help me apply very, very light pressure here. So I'm basically just fading that into the lightest area of that flower. So for the center, I'm going to bring out 3 or 2 YR markers and a Y marker, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on either side, but a little bit darker off to the right-hand side because the flower is kind of facing off to the left, and just keeping the center for the highlight. For these little, I guess they'd be berries, I'm going to bring out some V markers. And again, I am starting off with my lightest color just to get that paper saturated just a little bit. And these are round objects. So I'm going to leave a center highlight for each one of these. So I'm going to go in with my V09 and add just a little bit of shading to either side of this little berry, extend that out with the V06, then the V04, and then finish back off with that V01. Now I did get a lot of contrast, enough contrast as far as I'm concerned, so I didn't bother to bring out any pencils for this one. Same thing for the leaves. I'm going to bring out a YG combination, but I'm going to be using a G marker for the darkest color. But again, I'm going to start off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas and to get the paper saturated. And again, I got enough contrast where I didn't have to bring out any pencils for this one. Also, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the shape of each one of the leaves. Some of them are kind of twisty, and I'm adding some shading on both ends of the leaf, and others I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf. So you just want to kind of pay attention to the shape. So I went on and colored everything the same exact way as I showed you for the first 3 and with the same color combination. Then we can go ahead and assemble the card. So I'm going to take the 2 of the dies from the spring die set. I'm using the word and the smaller shadow. There's a larger shadow in the die set as well, but I didn't really have room for that. So I cut that out of white cardstock and decided I wanted my shadow to match these little berries to kind of make this stand out a little bit. So I'm going to use one of the markers that I used to color the berries to color my cardstock. Now you can certainly use colored cardstock for this, but I didn't feel like digging through my stash to try to find a cardstock that matched perfectly with the coloring. So it's just easier to pull out the same Copic markers that I use for the coloring. That way I know it matches perfectly. Next, I can assemble the rest of the sentiment, I guess you could say. So I am going to use my wet glue once again, because this does give me a second or two to kind of shift things around and make sure that it is lined up on that shadow. You can use double-sided tape, you can use the sticker maker, but just keep in mind that you might not have as much wiggle room as far as lining it up as you do with wet glue. So once that's done, that is going to go directly in the center of my card panel between my 2 floral arrangements. And I wanted to add a sentiment strip as well. And this is where I'm going to bring out the spring stamp set. And I wanted my sentiment strip, again, to match the coloring. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did for that shadow. I'm going to bring out a scrap piece of white cardstock, and I'm just going to use one of those V markers and just color a big chunk of that cardstock, and then I can treat that with my anti-static tool, and I stamped out the rest of the sentiment with Versamark ink. I'll sprinkle on a little bit of white embossing powder, and I know it looks a little crazy now. That's just because the anti-static tool that I used is very new, so there's a lot of powder residue left on there, but I'll fix that in just a minute. Once I heat set that and the embossing powder does have a couple of seconds to cool down, I can just take a towel and kind of wipe that powder off, and it brightens everything up. Went ahead and trimmed this down into a somewhat skinny strip, being I don't have a whole lot of room to work with here, and I cut off one end straight and the other end kind of at an angle just to add a little bit of interest. And I'll use some Scotch foam tape to pop that up directly under my sentiment, or my die cut sentiment I should say, which I glued down with that same Tabomono multi glue. Next, I took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to add a little bit of shimmer just to the purple berries in my little floral arrangement. And I squeezed this a little too much. So the shimmer was really flowing out of this pen. So off to the side, I am just scribbling off on a scrap piece of paper so that I don't get too much shimmer onto my card. Next, I will adhere this down to that card base that we had created in the beginning. Again, I definitely recommend using liquid glue for this because it does give you that couple of seconds to shift things around as you go. I'm going to add that same shimmer with that Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to just the letters of the spring, not the background, just the letters themselves. And then I can go over that entire word with some glossy accents. Now, I know that they have a precision tip that you can get. I don't have that. So I was just very careful as I was going through these letters. But once I was done, if there was any areas that kind of fell off those letters, or I just was a little too messy, I'm just using a craft knife to kind of scoop that glossy accents up before that dries. But that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.